Welcome to Shredder Fanfic. Like, subscribe, and hype video. Join members to gain early access to new videos. The main character, after dying in his previous life, gets reborn inside of How to Train Your Dragon, or HTTYD, and he is reborn as a Foreverwing. What will the Foreverwing do inside of How to Train Your Dragon?
HTTYD, what if I am the Foreverwing? Chapter 1, Stone Beneath My Wings. Death wasn't soft. I remember the impact. Not the sterile flash of white light, or some cliché of ascending weightlessly into the clouds. No. I remember asphalt. I remember my legs folding wrong, the heat of blood pooling around me in broad daylight, the confused cries of onlookers blurred by the high, thin sound in my ears. I had just gotten coffee. One blink, one blare of a horn, and then I was flying, but not the way I wanted. And yet, I woke up already in the sky. It didn't make sense at first. The sun wasn't glaring down at me, it was around me, curling on scales the color of cooled obsidian and ash. My wings stretched across half the sky, massive, veined, and slow as tectonic plates when I moved them. My back was heavy. Bone-shakingly heavy. But I wasn't in pain. I was high above a coastline I didn't recognize, except that I did. Dark cliffs plunged into the sea stacks rose like jagged teeth from silver-green water, and the mist rolled through narrow fjords and pine-covered isles. My thoughts lagged behind the wind for a moment. Then the recognition hit, slow and terrifying. I was in the archipelago. The barbaric archipelago. This was How to Train Your Dragon. The franchise. The movies, the show, the soft-spoken trauma beneath the cheerful Viking accents and flame-resistant tunics. I was in it, but that wasn't even the strangest part. I wasn't a writer. I wasn't a human. I looked down, and the sea didn't seem far, it seemed small. I blinked and distant clouds shifted. My neck moved like an avalanche turning its head. I stretched my wings again, and the wind screamed across their length. I could feel its resistance, the way you feel the mass of a truck against your shoulder if you tried to lean it upright alone. This body was ancient. Heavy. Vast. I had become a Foreverwing. And not just any Foreverwing. The Foreverwing. The Alpha. Below me, a dozen dragons swirled like embers caught in a thermal. I watched them move, not with the eye of a bird, but with something deeper, something strange. I could feel them. Feel their attention. Their deference. One nadir banked sharply, its scales a deep bronze. Another gronkel hovered a little too close to a stone arch before pulling back. They were watching me. Waiting. Responding to something in the air, something they could feel beneath their skulls. I didn't speak. I thought, and they moved. That was the moment I knew. I hadn't just been shoved into some random dragon's body. I'd been placed at the top of the chain. The alpha of the dragons. Before the bewildered beast. Before Toothless ever rose. If this was early canon, and it had to be, then I was deep in the pre-hiccup era. Far removed from Burke. My territory was untouched by human maps. And I liked it that way. I tilted my wings and descended. The wind parted for me like it was under my command, dragging low fog across a forested island that stretched for miles. It wasn't lush, it was dense, knotted with moss-heavy pines and fissured rock. Ancient. The earth here had folded in on itself ages ago and never smoothed out. When I landed, the ground trembled. Roots shivered. Birds scattered. The forest around me went still. My claws sank into stone, and I let my weight settle. The vibrations of my landing carried outwards like a distant drumbeat. In the silence that followed, the air seemed to pulse with recognition. Dozens, hundreds of small minds stirred at the edge of my perception. Dragons. I reached out again, cautiously. There was no sound. No real voice. Just presence. My awareness pushed outward like heat from a flame, brushing against the minds of every dragon on the island. Some were small and twitchy terrible terrors hiding in cliffside burrows. Others were broad and sluggish older dragons sleeping in hollowed trees, or basking in sun-warmed craters. They all felt it. Me. The Alpha. I didn't understand the mechanics of it yet. The movies made it seem like alpha dragons used sonic calls or pheromones, something primal and animalistic. But this was different. It was deep. Like a second language I'd never learned but could now instinctively speak. My influence wasn't control. It was resonance. And they were resonating. I pulled back, careful not to project anything too intense. The power was raw, and I was still learning to wrap my mind around it. My body itched to move, but the movement of something this size was never just movement, it was declaration. The trees didn't just rustle when I walked. They parted. It took half an hour to navigate to the center of the island. There, hidden between high cliffs and thick tree lines, was what I assumed was the Foreverwing's nesting hollow, a vast caldera where roots tangled like veins, and volcanic stone layered in crumbling terraces. A massive stone slab slouched over the hollow like a fallen lid. Beneath it, warmth rose from deep underground geothermal. Comfortable. The moment I entered, a ripple went out. Dragons emerged from the edges. Dozens of eyes reflected pale green light. No one moved too fast. No one challenged. I walked slowly to the center. Lay down. Waited. They gathered. Storm cutters, grand CKLs, 2 monstrous nightmares, and a handful of rare breeds I didn't recognize. Maybe minor subspecies. All of them watched me. Some stood at the edges, cautious. Others inched closer, their wings tight to their bodies in submission. I exhaled. It wasn't just relief. It was power. Comfort. Sanctuary. In my old life, I had never mattered like this. I was just a name shredder. A guy who had worked retail, played MMOs, and dodged rent calls. I wasn't a leader. I wasn't feared. I wasn't followed. Now, dragons listened. The thought almost made me laugh. Except I couldn't laugh anymore, not really. My body didn't work like that. But something flickered in my chest. Something warm. I had been reborn. I didn't understand why. I didn't need to. Whatever strange cosmic reroll had put me in this world, I wasn't going to waste it. I was going to rule it. Carefully. Quietly. No one would know my name. But dragons would feel my will in their bones. And I would grow. This island was mine. But the world was wide. Burke was still a speck on the edge of the map. Valka was probably still in her village. Draco hadn't yet risen. The dragon world was unclaimed. I would change that. Not with war. With presence. First, I would gather. Expand my reach, my awareness. There were other Foreverwings, territorial, old, hidden. I could feel their distant pulses at the edge of my mind like sleeping gods. They would feel me soon. And when they did, they would understand. The Alpha had awakened. Not a tyrant. Not a beast. Something else. Something that remembered dying on a road with a paper cup in hand and 1,000 dreams unrealized. Something that had no intention of wasting this second life. Chapter 2, Roots Beneath the Skin. My body moved like the land had been shaped to fit it. Each step pressed deep into soil still wet from last night's mist. Trees leaned back on their roots as I passed, not out of fear, but because they remembered. The Foreverwing was not a tyrant to this island. It was part of it. The memory lived in the forest itself, in the curling moss and sun-heavy stone. I could feel it pressing upward from the roots beneath me like heat, but slower. More patient. I had always liked the idea of solitude. In life, it was something I chased but never truly found. The city never slept, and neither did the thoughts. I used to sit in dark rooms with headphones on and pretend the static was peace. Now, there was no pretending. Silence rolled in waves over this island. No planes. No buzz of phones. No dull hum of refrigerator coils. Just the wind and the birds and the ancient rhythm of my own body. I moved slowly through the forest, dragging my weight across sun-dappled clearings and narrow ridge paths that cracked under my claws. My wings folded tight against my back, not for stealth I couldn't hide if I tried but for respect. This island didn't need domination. It needed presence. Dragons stirred ahead of me, flickering between treetops and wind-caught ledges. A few flapped into the open air when I approached, rising in loose, spiraling arcs. Not in fear. In celebration. One natter, young and bright-scaled, passed low overhead, its wingtips brushing the canopy. Another followed it, letting out a short, crackling bark. Then 3 more. In seconds, the clearing around me buzzed with movement, dragons circling above, sweeping close, diving and climbing in wide loops. Not wild flight. Not chaos. They were showing off. Not to impress. To honor. To fly for me. I stopped in the middle of the clearing and lowered my weight to the earth, letting my chin rest against the ground. My breath pushed up small clouds of dust and pollen. The island breathed with me, slow and rhythmic, like something old settling into its bones. And then I felt it. Not emotion. Not thought. Life. A strange warmth behind the sternum. Not physical. Not exactly. A sensation like vines unfurling just behind the mind. Not a memory. Not instinct. An ability. I remembered the Foreverwing's nature from the franchise. In the show, it wasn't just a massive dragon. It was the forest. It made things grow. Controlled plant life like it was an extension of its body. At the time, it had been played off as vaguely mystical, a passive presence. But standing here now, as it, I understood something deeper. The island wasn't just my territory. It was mine. Like my own skin. I reached downward not with claws, but with focus. Like flexing a new muscle that had always been there, dormant and slow to stir. I dug into the warmth I felt beneath the earth, into that green-tinted awareness that laced the ground like roots. The plants heard me. Not with ears. With life. I pushed. Gently. The moss beneath me deepened, darkened, thickened. Around the edges of the clearing, vines curled tighter around the trees, then grew outward, their tips twitching. In seconds, the underbrush greened. Buds split open. Ferns uncurled. I didn't move. Just breathed. Grow. The word wasn't spoken. It echoed somewhere deeper. And the forest answered. The trees responded in waves, their leaves stretching wider, their roots thickening in the ground like muscle hardening beneath flesh. Flowers bloomed on vines that hadn't existed minutes ago. Fruit swelled on narrow branches that once hung barren. And around me, the dragons responded. They paused in flight. Drifted lower. Stilled. Not in fear. In reverence. Their minds touched mine, faint, not invasive. Passive signals. Not quite thought, but awareness. I had nudged the island's breath. They had felt it. And something in them, something old and instinctive, sang back in response. A dozen minds. Then 50. Then more. From across the ridges. From inside shallow caves. From nests hidden in overgrown craters and along the cliffs that faced the sea. I hadn't known they were there. Not until now. But now I could sense them. They weren't my dragons. Not yet. Some didn't even know who I was. But they were near. Living on the edge of my influence. Close enough to hear the echo of the alpha. Skittish. Watching. I opened myself further. It wasn't painful. but it was vast. Like unfolding a sense that had always been blindfolded. I let my awareness pulse outward in a slow wave. Not aggressive. Just present. Dragons blinked in the shadowed hills. A typhomerang, old and reclusive, stirred in a crevice lined with stone-split roots. It felt the shift in the trees above and didn't flee. A pair of scaldrons watched from the narrow water inlets on the northern shore, their presence flickering like fish under a wave. None of them moved. But they knew. They knew the island was no longer asleep. And neither was I. More plants bloomed in my wake as I rose, my steps heavier now. Purposeful. I turned toward a ridge that overlooked the sea, one I'd flown past earlier but not explored. As I walked, the forest followed. Vines curled up from the edges of my path and trailed behind me like a tail. Trees leaned closer. Not in submission. In curiosity. The roots had felt my touch, and now they reached for it again. It wasn't druidic. It wasn't magic. It was communion. A trade. I gave the land my strength. It gave me presence. At the top of the ridge, I paused. The wind came in sharp, laced with sea salt and cold air from the north. I looked out across the island's small, scattered dots of green in a steel-colored ocean. From here, the world looked untouched. But I knew it wasn't. Somewhere out there, humans were beginning to tame dragons. Not yet with love. Not yet with Hiccup's words. But with nets and fire and greed. Dragon trappers. Wild tribes. The early movements of what would one day become a war. But that war wasn't here. Not yet. Here, I was still legend. A force. A whisper in the canopy and a shadow over the stone. That would change. Word would spread. Curious dragons would come. Maybe even distant alphas. I could feel them in the far reaches of my mind, dormant, slow-breathing forces not yet aware of my return. But they would be. For now, I was not hunted. I was home. And the island was beginning to wake with me. Chapter 3, Forest of the Divided Wind. The wind had changed. Not in strength, nor direction. But in the way it moved through the trees. I could feel it more clearly now, tugging at the moss-draped branches and whispering between roots like a language I had finally begun to understand. The forest listened. It remembered where I had walked. It had started growing toward me when I passed. And I was ready to shape it. The idea had come during the night. I had curled beneath the shelf rock canopy of the caldera where warm mist clung to the ground and let myself drift not into sleep. Sleep was light and shallow in a body this vast, but into stillness. And in the stillness, I had felt the dragons. Too many. Not in numbers, but in proximity. Clustering too tightly in the same nesting hollows. Roosting on the same perches. Hunting in the same thickets. A storm cutter had nearly torn the wing from a young hobble grunt earlier that day, both reaching for the same fire fruit bush. It hadn't been malice. It had been crowding. I was their alpha. But an alpha who let dragons snap at each other over food would not stay alpha for long. The stories never said that. But I had watched enough of this world to know. Dominance alone didn't keep dragons together. But design would. So at dawn, I rose. And I began the first shaping of the island. I moved south, through the oldest parts of the forest where the cliffs narrowed and the trees grew tall and proud. The dragons followed from a distance, dozens of them. Some low in the brush, others overhead. Curious. Observing. My presence no longer drew fear. But it still commanded silence. I stopped where the earth sloped gently downward in a bowl-like dip between ridges. The trees here were spindly, too close together, their canopies thin. Sunlight poured in through them in strips. It was already warm. This would be the first zone. I reached downward with my awareness, feeling the roots clustered below. I pushed gently and the oldest, tallest trees relaxed, their trunks softening, narrowing. I let them fall. Their bodies crashed down slowly, without splintering. I guided their weight into the ground. I made room. Then I bent the new growth upward, faster and shorter. Bushes. Thick grasses. Low tangling shrubs that bore berries and insect-rich leaves. Nothing tall. No canopy. The perfect territory for small dragons. I thought of terrible terrors, nervous, jumpy things that flew erratically and needed dry space to perch close to the ground. I thought of smothering smoke breaths, opportunistic feeders who would thrive in a place they could scout from low branches. I shaped the glade for them. Fruit-bearing bushes ripened within minutes. Flat rocks grew warm under the growing sun. Low, flat logs uncoiled from the roots to form rest spots. I didn't have to force the dragons in. They came on their own. 2 terrors flitted in first, chirping at each other, wings tucked tightly as they sniffed at the ground. Then 4. Then more. A timberjack landed near the edge, observing but not entering. It wasn't his space and he seemed to know it. The division was beginning. I left the clearing in silence and moved higher into the ridge where the trees grew thicker and the ground was less fertile. Here, I slowed my growth. Let the natural forest breathe. But I pruned. Carefully. Deliberately. Tall trees, evenly spaced. I shaped the trunks to remain far enough apart that a monstrous nightmare could coil between them without brushing against bark. No bramble. No clutter. Shade, quiet, distance. A place for larger dragons to rest. Storm cutters needed open spaces to fold their double sets of wings. Grand CKLs hated cramped caves. Snap trappers preferred tall, spaced boughs to avoid being startled. Here, I gave them that. The forest bent to my will slowly. Respectfully. And I shaped with restraint. Not every branch. Not every root. I let the imperfections remain. It had to feel like a home, not a sculpture. By midday, dragons had started to claim spots. One nightmare draped itself across a bough I had just widened. A gronkel rolled into a bed of warm dust that hadn't existed this morning. The island was changing. But it wasn't until late afternoon that I turned toward the north end, the deepest stretch of forest where the cliffs grew jagged and the mist lingered past noon. Here, I made something different. I slowed the plants. Thickened the trunks. Grew the underbrush tight and high, thorny and clinging. I narrowed the spaces between trees until even a small dragon would struggle to walk between them with wings folded. I filled the space with shade. Dark leaves. Cool soil. Patches of tall grass too dense for wing beats. Thickets that tangled on purpose. Then gently I searched with my awareness. Beyond dragons. Past birds. For life lower on the chain. Small, warm minds flickered at the edge of perception. Mammals, mostly. Wild boar. Elk. Hare. Rodents. None intelligent. None threatening. Just alive. I pushed. Slowly. Carefully. Not fear. Not command. Just encouragement. The vines moved ahead of me like a rising tide, opening just enough of a corridor that the animals began to drift. First 1. Then 3. Then whole family groups. I did not trap them. I invited them. Pushed them into the safe place. Where no dragon could follow. A sanctuary for breeding. For life to root itself again in safety. This forest would feed itself. Grow from within. Let prey flourish without being devoured to extinction. It was balance. I turned back when the last elk slipped behind the newly grown thorn wall, its hooves quiet on softened moss. The sun had begun to fall by the time I reached the ridge again. Dragons had settled. Some in the glade. Some in the high, spaced groves. A few circled still above the misty north, confused but curious. They wouldn't find a path in. Not unless I made one. And I would not. Balance had to begin somewhere. I had made territory. Not just ruled it. And they felt it. That night, the dragons sang. Not in words. Not in any human melody. But in howls and hums, the deep-bellied rumble of peace. Some slept curled beside each other. Others lay in trees alone but not uneasy. And I lay again in the caldera hollow, the earth still warm beneath me. I had not spoken a word. But the island understood me. And it was listening still. Chapter 4, The Island That Breathes. The forest had a rhythm now. It wasn't something loud or obvious. It pulsed in the way dragons walked without looking behind them. In the way the trees shifted just enough when a gronkel brushed past, as if already used to her lumbering bulk. In the quiet, too, especially in the quiet. Stillness here no longer meant waiting for something to go wrong. It meant rest. That was new. I stood high on the spine of the central ridge, wings tucked in, claws curled into ancient volcanic rock slick with dew. Above me, the sky was layered in soft grey, the kind that held back the sun without drowning it. The dragons flew anyway. They didn't mind the gloom. Below, a natter and a whispering death chased each other between the tall trees of the rest grove I'd shaped the day before. Not hunting. Not fighting. Just playing. The whispering death spiraled up and over a crooked pine, hissing lazily. The natter barked once and Dove, twisting midair and flaring her wings out too wide, clipped a branch and rolled into a clumsy landing. She got up. Flicked her head. Tried again. I didn't need to speak to feel the joy coming off her like heat. This place was working. My place. I watched them for a long time. Just watched. The way their wings sliced the air. The way they reacted to one another. It wasn't just instinct. There was structure to it. Unspoken rules. A dance. This world, as brutal and sharp-edged as it could be, still held beauty. It wasn't gentle, but it was real. Honest in its wildness. And I'd come back to it not as some knight or rider or boy with a dream. I had come back as a mountain that breathes. A dragon older than the legends. And somehow, that made it all feel real. Not like a cartoon. Not like a children's film I'd watched at age 20 while waiting for my Uber Eats to arrive. This world was full of danger and power, yes, but it was also filled with order. Natural order. No offices. No roads. Just air, soil, root, and sky. And I could shape it. That thought stuck with me. Not just influence or command. Shape. The glades I'd made were just the beginning. I had called them into being, made zones for different dragons to nest, to rest, to hide prey. But I hadn't tested the limits yet. Not really. So I did. I moved back toward the southern coast of the island, to a wide jut of stone that dropped off into open sea. It had no vegetation. No nesting spots. Just rock. Useless, except for the view. I crouched at the edge and stared down at the waves. Then I planted both front claws into the stone. And I called. Not loudly. Not like a roar. I didn't even open my mouth. It came from somewhere deep in my chest. Somewhere tied to the way the trees knew me. Vines. Thick ones. They began to grow, slow at first, from the cracks in the stone. They emerged not like weeds, but like creatures waking from long sleep. Twisting. Wrapping. Curling down the cliff face in heavy coils that looped and tightened until they reached the surf. I didn't stop. I kept feeding the growth. The vines reached the water. Then they bridged it. Not thin threads. Not stringy little creepers. Real vines. As thick as a dragon's torso. They wove themselves together with moss and bark, forming layers. Binding. Strengthening. Becoming something more than root. They formed land. Artificial? Sure. But alive. I pushed further. Extended the growth out into the sea, a few meters at a time. It took effort. I could feel my core cooling, a kind of drag behind my chest that made me blink slower, breathe deeper. But it worked. The vines thickened. Hardened. Then came the moss. Then the soil. I shaped the new land like a cradle. Wide enough for a dragon to land and sleep on. Shallow enough not to block sea traffic for any aquatic species that needed to pass. When I was done 10 minutes later, there was a floating isle hanging off the southern edge of my territory. Not fake. Not brittle. An extension of the forest. One dragon tested it within an hour, a long-bodied flight mare who had kept her distance since my first landing. She landed on the new platform. Waited. Shifted. No give. No collapse. Then she laid down. And stayed. I didn't cheer. Not out loud. But something deep in my core lit up. I wasn't just maintaining territory. I was building it. And this changed everything. If I could expand the island, I could shape where dragons went. Not just in territory, but in travel. I could create rest spots for tired flyers. Forge islands between the real islands. Claim airspace. That meant something. It meant I didn't need to fight the future. Not like Draco did, with blood and fear. Not like the Red Death did, with scale and swarm. I could build the future. Let them come. Let Burke rise, let trappers sail, let alphas wake up in the deep. I had something they didn't. I had roots. And they were only getting deeper. Chapter 5, Path of Green Across the Sea. The island behind me was breathing. It wasn't a metaphor. Not anymore. I could feel it in the tension of the roots beneath the soil, in the rhythm of the moss that pulled moisture from the air. Every vine I'd grown pulsed faintly with the same pressure I felt when I turned my thoughts inward, when I focused not on movement, but on reach. It felt like standing on a lung that exhaled with the tides. I stood at the edge of the southern cliffs again, claws sunk into stone that had been here longer than any tribe or dragon. Below, the platform I'd grown yesterday floated gently on the waves, too heavy to drift, too alive to sink. The flight mare still nested on it, tail curled protectively around herself. She hadn't left. Neither had I. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That strip of vine and moss wasn't just proof of power. It was a signal. A test. Something new. What if it didn't end here? That question had followed me all night. I'd moved through the trees, restless. I'd added to the small dragon glade, reshaped a few thorn banks for prey animals, reinforced the root structure beneath one of the stormcutter nests. All things I'd meant to do. All things I finished early. But the question stayed. How far could I go? Could I stretch the island? Not with stone and dirt. With life. Not just one landing pad. A path. Not for dragons that followed me already. For those that didn't. Yet. There were islands beyond my own. Not far, not by flight. But to a terrible terror, or a hobble grunt, the journey across open sea could mean death. I'd seen it in the show. Watched smaller dragons get picked off by storms, sea dragons, exhaustion. They didn't all have riders to carry them across. But what if they didn't need riders? What if I could build the sky for them? It wouldn't be a bridge. Too obvious. Too much like something humans would build. This needed to be quiet. Subtle. Natural. A sky path. Floating land. Breathing land. Each piece alive, each one feeding the next. And if I could make it long enough to reach the next island, I wouldn't just be growing territory. I'd be growing empire. Not ruled by fear. Not chained by flame. But connected. That morning, I took flight. Slowly. Everything I did was slow, not because I was cautious, but because there was no fast way to move a body this size. When my wings opened, the trees bowed. When I rose, the cliff cracked beneath my hind legs. Dragons paused to watch. None followed. Not yet. They understood this was not a hunt. This was a test. I flew out over the sea directly south where the mist thinned and the water flattened into sheets of silver. I didn't go far. Just until the island was small behind me and the nearest speck of green was visible ahead. A tiny, ragged islet. Untouched. Not big enough to hold a community. But big enough for a landing. That was all I needed. I hovered. Wings wide, breath deep. I tilted into the wind and reached down. Grow. There wasn't soil here. There was no root system. But I didn't need one. I focused. The same way I had on the cliffside, I called from deep within. Not from thought. From will. The place in me that held green heat and knew how to twist bark, weave leaf, harden vine until it was more than growth. Until it was structure. The first vines came up from the sea, not anchored to the seabed too deep but to each other. Floating. Weaving. Layering. They rose beneath me in a slow spiral. I turned in the air and watched them wind into shape. They didn't rot. They breathed. A wide circle formed 15 paces across. Then I called moss. Bark. Growth that made it soft and safe for landing. No thorns. No tangle. Just enough yield to keep a dragon comfortable. When it was done, I landed. The platform held. Solid. And not just that. Alive. I could feel it in my legs the way you feel warm sand shift under your feet. I was standing on something connected. Not just grown. Grown from me. This was the first step. I flew again. Built the second platform halfway to the islet. Then the third. Each took longer than the last. The reach was getting harder. The connection stretched thinner. I could feel my body slowing, the green fire in my chest dimming. Not fading. But cooling. There were limits. Of course there were. But I wasn't anywhere near them yet. By the time the sun had begun to fall behind the ridge, I'd created 5 platforms. Each one floating. Each one shaped to hold a dragon, large or small. All of them alive. When I reached the islet, I landed and turned back. From this height, I could see them. 5 soft green discs arcing across the water. Breathable. Restable. Real. A path. Not a road. A migration route. The dragons would follow it in time. The young ones. The wanderers. The ones who hadn't picked sides yet. Who drifted between islands, never finding a real home. Now they had direction. And if I kept growing? If I could reach the next archipelago? I wouldn't be a regional alpha anymore. I'd be something else. Something that connected the dragon world not by force but by shelter. Not a king. Not a god. Something older. Something patient. I didn't fly back that night. I stayed on the islet. Let the mist rise around me. Let the sea speak in its endless low whisper. And when I closed my eyes, I felt the roots behind me, humming in rhythm. They were waiting for more. They knew I would give it. Chapter 6, The Song That Would Not Bend. The first sign was the silence. Not the deep, forested quiet that settled over the island each night like a blanket of mist, but a hollow kind. Sharp. pulled taut between the trees like a bowstring. Even the wind felt strained, scraping through the leaves instead of rustling them. Birds had vanished. Terrors crouched in their dens. Grand CKLs, usually slow to spook, had taken to sleeping close together, their eyes half open. I felt it before I heard it. A hum. At first low, almost indistinct. But too clean to be natural. Not the droning of insects or the distant sigh of sea breeze. This was pitch perfect, sharpened to a razor's edge. Not beautiful. Not haunting. Territorial. I turned toward the southern sky. It wasn't a roar. Death songs didn't roar. They sang. Their voices wrapped the air like silk and strangled it before you realized what was missing. I opened my wings and leapt from the caldera ridge without hesitation. The sky burned low with a soft orange haze, the sun already drowned behind thick clouds. The floating vine platforms shimmered ahead, 5 of them, stretched across the sea in lazy arcs. At their center, hovering above the third, was the source of the song. Slender. Long-winged. Colored like flame seen through amber. The death song drifted in lazy, arrogant spirals above my creation, each pass paired with a sustained note that thickened the air beneath it. I felt the vines shift. The moss pulse. It wasn't just singing. It was claiming. I growled. Low. Not because I wanted to startle it. Not yet. But because the island inside me did. The roots in my body curled inward, the same way claws flex before they strike. My wings pulled tighter. I descended, slow and deliberate, to the platform directly in front of the death song's circle. It noticed. Its next note bent, slightly. Less pure. A flicker of recognition slid across its long, thin face. But it didn't stop singing. I landed hard enough to make the vines tremble. The platform held. My weight pressed the moss into the root net below. I extended my will downward, strengthened the connection to the platform. Mine. The death song descended 2 meters. Still out of reach. Still proud. I did not reach back. I watched. It circled once more, voice rising, a layered harmony, now the kind meant to coax weaker dragons into flightless surrender. The kind that turned muscle into syrup and mind into water. I felt it trying. It met a wall. I didn't recoil. I let the song slide over me like rain over stone. I was older than this melody. Deeper than its pull. I had been rooted to this world before this dragon had hatched. It tried again. Sharper notes now. Less coaxing. More demand. The platform beneath me began to ripple slightly, like water under strain. So I answered. Not with song. With growth. I reached down into the vine net. Into the coil of root and leaf that connected me to the island. I fed it strength. Will. Direction. The platform beneath the death song began to shift. Slowly. No violence. Just change. Vines began to tighten. Moss receded. The platform coiled inward, folding like a fist. Not to trap but to displace. Reject. The death song stopped singing. Floated backward, wings tight. Confused. It circled lower, slow now. Looking for an opening. For understanding. Still, I didn't speak. I reached out this time not through the roots, but through the air itself. The same deep sense I used to feel dragons across the island. I touched its presence. It wasn't wild. Not completely. Older. Wiser than most. Not a hatchling looking for a perch. This was a dragon who had ruled a cliff ring on its own terms. Who had kept trappers at bay with silence and lure. It had seen alpha fights. Had never bowed. Not even once. And yet it had flown here. It had followed the sky path. It didn't know why. But it had. That mattered. I pulled back. Stepped forward on the platform. The vines answered by uncoiling in front of me, growing just enough to make room. The death song held position. Wings wide now. Not hostile. Guarded. I stepped again. Then stopped. Waited. It dropped 1 meter. Unwilling to land. Unwilling to leave. A tension hung between us like a stretched net. One shift from either of us and it could snap. So I did something new. I bowed my head. Not far. Just enough. I felt the air change. The death song hesitated. Then slowly it descended to the far edge of the platform. It didn't sing. It didn't submit. But it landed. And stayed. We watched each other until the wind changed again. When I finally lifted off, the platform was still intact. The vines had relaxed. The moss had begun to regrow. The death song remained behind me, wings folded, eyes half shut. It had not joined me. But it hadn't rejected me, either. That, I could live with. Some dragons don't submit. They linger. They test. And eventually, they choose. Or they don't. Either way, I had made space for them. That was all I needed. Chapter 7, The Orphan Archipelago. The new platforms held 16 in total, woven from vine and bark, layered in slow-growing moss that curled upward at the edges to cradle sleeping dragons. I felt them beneath my mind like heartbeat echoes, each alive, each awake in ways stone never could be. They formed a broken arc across the sea now, long enough to reach the far southern islands that dotted the ocean like scatterings of broken teeth. They didn't show up on any human maps. I didn't need a map. I could feel them. The last platform brought me within gliding distance of the new cluster. That morning, I flew with my wings low and my senses open. The wind turned strange the closer I came. Not foul, just thin. Like it had been sucked out and not replaced. The islands ahead weren't large. The biggest could have fit inside my caldera. But they were shaped wrong. Hollowed. Blackened at the edges. Trees stripped of bark. Craters where nests should have been. And in the center of it all, movement. Dozens of small dragons. Too small. Too hungry. I circled high above, wings still, body casting shadow over the heart of the broken archipelago. Below, a dozen heads turned upward in staggered unison. Their bodies recoiled. Not from fear. From expectation. I landed on the edge of the largest island and pressed my claws into the brittle soil. It cracked beneath me like dry bone. I didn't move. They came forward on their own. First one. A small skrilling, no older than a year, wings torn at the edge, tail missing half a spike. It limped forward, paused, sniffed the air, then lay down just outside my reach. It didn't look up again. Not a challenge. Not submission. Just exhaustion. Then more. 3 natters. A pair of gronklets, their eyes wide and stomachs drawn in. 2 whispering death hatchlings moved in spirals around a ruined tree, growling at no one. I didn't need to speak. The shape of this place already told the story. These weren't wild dragons. They were leftovers. Scattered remnants of broods abandoned or broken. Orphans who had tried to nest here after storms or culling flights. Some had wings too small. Some had no flock. Others had been wounded and chased away from more dominant territories. They had come here because no one else had. Because nothing wanted it. I felt my weight press deeper into the island. It rejected me. Not in hate. In pain. It had no roots left. So I gave it mine. I stepped into the center of the clearing and breathed low, long, into the soil. Then I reached down. Not just for vines. For connection. The forest here didn't respond the way my home island had. It twitched. Pulled back. Skeptical. Too many fires. Too much ash. Roots here had been burned, then grown back twisted. I did not command. I soothed. The green inside me, my power, my will slowed. Deepened. I gave warmth, not force. Nourishment, not domination. I offered growth, not structure. Time, not control. And something answered. The first vine rose slowly. Tentatively. A weak curl of green near the shattered remains of a stone nest. Then more. Leaf by leaf. Inch by inch. I kept the pressure steady. Gave without asking. Moss returned. Roots reknit. Soil softened beneath my claws, drinking the breath of life like a forgotten throat discovering water. The dragons felt it. One natter collapsed into a crouch and began purring, wings limp. A gronklet curled beside it, trembling slightly, then stilled. They weren't just tired. They were waiting to die. No one had ever come for them before. They didn't understand this was real. I watched them for hours. No dragon over 6 meters. Most under 3. Babies, half-grown misfits, throwaways. Not feral. Not hostile. Just unwanted. I did not offer roars. I did not flex my wings. I grew shade. I grew fruit-bearing bushes. I thickened the roots beneath the dead trees, turning them into shelters wide and hollow, but warm. A few of the younger dragons sniffed at the moss, then settled inside. One curled against the curved bark like it had been born there. It hadn't. But now it would stay. That night, I returned to the central islet of my sky path and lay across its surface without sleeping. I thought. These dragons weren't mine in the way others were. They hadn't bowed. They didn't know what it meant to follow. They knew only hunger and fear. They were wounded animals with no memory of structure. But I couldn't leave them. They would die within months. Or worse, be taken. I had seen what dragon trappers did to weak ones. How they caged young Grand CKLs, sawed their horns off, used them as bait for bigger kills. I remembered it from the films. It had always made me sick. Now it made me boil. This was my territory. My sky path brought me here. My roots had made this land green again. So I would take these orphans in. They were mine. Not in name. In responsibility. And I would shape a place for them. Not in the core of my island. Not yet. They needed space. Quiet. Time. But I would build it. A grove just for them. Low trees. Soft moss. A place to grow. Not a nursery. A home. And in time, they would become something more. Not soldiers. Not subjects. Something else. A generation. One that never had to bow to fire or claw. One that only knew roots. Chapter 8, The Broken Crown. I smelled it before I saw it. The wind had shifted again southerly, heavy with sea salt and something older. Something not of this island. The scent carried up through the ridge and into the canopy, where dragons had begun to perch in pairs, heads turned toward the cliffs. It was not panic in their posture. But it wasn't ease either. The whispering deaths burrowed deeper than usual. Storm cutters held their wings close, as if waiting for storm squalls. Even the natters, ever alert and twitching, had quieted. Their eyes all turned toward the southern shoreline. I opened my wings. Flew low over the moss-stretched forest until the trees fell away behind me and the sea opened up like a wound. He was already on the shore. Not moving quickly. Not needing to. The tide receded around him as if it too understood what he was. The sand didn't crunch beneath him, it sank, weightless, beneath something older than memory. I landed 100 meters upwind and watched. He didn't look at me. Not at first. He was massive, but not in the way I was. My body was layered in rock-thick scales, muscles like cables braided under moss-slick skin. This one was all bone and scar. His neck was long, curved unnaturally, bent where vertebrae hadn't healed right. One wing dragged behind him, webbing torn, fused to the side with a lattice of pale tissue. He bled slowly from the mouth as he walked. But his presence was complete. Old power. Burnt. Shattered. But alive. I stepped forward once. My weight cracked the shale beneath me. The wind caught his scent, fully now iron and salt, and something rotten behind it. His eyes lifted. One was blind, milked over. The other locked onto mine. He didn't speak. Not aloud. But he asked. Not to join. Not to rest. To end. Here. Now. And I knew what that meant. He wasn't submitting to the island. He was challenging it. He had come to die, but not as a corpse. Not as a fading ghost curled under some root bed like a forgotten beast. He had come to test the will of the new Alpha. And I understood, in that moment, the truth of ancient law. There were no retirements in the old way. Only the broken crown. He opened his jaws and roared. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sounded like a glacier splitting, a lifetime of bitterness poured into one long exhale. The sky shook. Not with volume. With authority. Dragons heard it across the island. I felt them go still. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Watching. Waiting. If I backed down just once, the roots I'd grown would wilt. The order would fray. Not today. But eventually. Because dragons don't follow mercy. They follow strength. I stepped forward and roared back. My breath churned the sand into waves. My chest burned. Not with fire but with something deeper. Green flame. Not heat, not ash. Growth. Will. The forest in my blood rose behind me. His wings flared. Limp, yes. But the other still opened. He charged. It wasn't graceful. Not the way a storm cutter dives or a nadir spins. It was pure force. Every step crushed stone. His body didn't move like it was meant to live, it moved like it had already died and chosen to rise again for one more kill. I didn't fly. I met him. We collided near the shore, where salt water hissed between our limbs. My jaw caught his shoulder. Bone cracked. He slammed his skull into my neck, not biting, but hammering like a battering ram. I stumbled. Not far. But enough. The sand behind me turned red. His claws tore at my flank, not deep, but fast. Precise. This wasn't rage. This was ritual. Every blow calculated. Every breath measured. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to prove he could still fight. I responded with root. Vines lashed up from the sand mine, pulsing with the same energy that shaped the sky path. They caught his back leg and yanked. He fell forward, but twisted midair. Bit into my shoulder. I roared. Slammed him into the beach with my full weight. The ground gave way beneath us. Water surged over our legs. Seafoam boiled around our claws. He didn't let go. So I dragged him into the surf. Waves crashed over our backs. I crushed him beneath the tide, holding his head to the sand. Still, he didn't yield. His tail whip struck the base of my wing. I shifted my weight and pulled back. He rolled. Coughed blood. staggered to one leg, then charged again. No hesitation. I met him one last time. Teeth found throat. Not deep. Not fatal. I didn't squeeze. But I could have. We froze like that. Salt and wind screamed around us. He did not growl. Did not thrash. He went still. Waited. I let him go. He fell sideways, gasping. The sea crawled around his belly. And then only then he exhaled. His neck dropped to the sand. Not broken. Just done. I stepped back, chest heaving, blood cooling on my scales. Behind me, in the distance, I felt the dragons shift. They weren't cheering. But they were watching. The forest hummed, quiet. Roots thickened below the shore, sensing new soil. New power. I turned away from him. Left him there, at the edge of the tide. Not dead. Not alpha. Just remembered. He had come to test the future. And now he would sleep beside it. Chapter 9, Nest Beneath the Root. The grove had grown thick in a week. Low trees ringed the perimeter like gentle walls, their trunks twisted by my own will to curve inward, not upward. No dragon taller than 3 meters could fly between them without folding their wings. I'd layered the inner canopy in moss boughs and slow-fruiting vines, plants chosen for their warmth and softness rather than their yield. The orphans had moved in slowly, unsure at first. But now they nested like they'd never lived elsewhere. They no longer flinched when I passed overhead. Some of them even chirped. They did not know the word safe, but they were beginning to learn what it felt like. It was morning when the grove changed again. I had flown out early to extend the sea path another 2 platforms westward, already pushing the limits of my reach. The wind had carried news across the vine roots, small ripples of motion in the network of life that pulsed through my awareness. A gronklet had begun hoarding eggshells. A natterling had been seen trying to light leaves with sparks from its throat, practicing too young. But it was none of that which stopped me. It was the pulse. A sharp, warm throb from the grove's center. Too soft to be pain. Too warm to be threat. But alive. And new. I returned by mid-morning, my wings low against the thermals. The dragons below me parted like ripples in a shallow pool, scattering without fear. I landed just outside the center, where I'd layered the moss thickest. The pulsing came again. Beneath the root curl of a shaped tree, hidden behind an arc of bramble I had grown only to keep moisture in the soil, lay a cradle not of stone or nest-spun leaves, but of earth that had been softened by generations of warmth. At its center, cracked open along one jagged seam, lay the egg. Half its shell remained intact, still pulsing slightly, still warm. But it was split now, and from within the curve of its last protection lay something small, coiled, slick with warmth and instinct. It chirped. Once. Loudly. Then shuddered and coughed. A newborn. No parents in sight. No matching scent. I scanned the grove slowly. No grown CKLs hovered nearby. No mother natters watched from the tree line. No dragon claimed the egg. No one. It had simply hatched. Not from the wild. From the island. I stepped closer. The hatchling blinked. Its eyes were too large for its head. Blue, not pale. Horns still soft at the tip. Wings damp, curled against a spine that hadn't straightened yet. Its breathing was shallow, but even. I lowered my head. Close. It chirped again. This time softer. And tried to stand. Its leg slipped. It flopped sideways, half in the shell, limbs wriggling. I reached out with a single claw, not touching. Just curling a vine forward, one that grew from the root around the cradle. The vine dipped gently beneath the hatchling's body and lifted it upright. The dragonlet chirped again. Didn't resist. Didn't flee. It leaned against the vine and stayed. There were rules in the wild. Even alpha dragons didn't raise the young of others. They protected nests. Maintained territory. But parenting was not part of the role. I remembered that. But I didn't care. This island wasn't just wild anymore. It was mine. And I would make my own laws. I lowered my head further and let my breath warm the air around the hatchling. My presence curled around it like a second nest. It didn't cower. Its eyes closed slowly, and it slept. Not all dragons are born ready. Some need time. Some need guidance. And some need a parent. I would be that. For this one. Not as a mate. As a father. I had no name for it. It was too early. Its body was thin, its species uncertain. There were traits of an adder crest shape, talon structure, but its wings were wide like a skrill's, with bones heavier than either. A hybrid? Maybe. It didn't matter. It was mine now. I stayed beside the cradle the rest of the morning. Not moving. Letting my warmth flow into the root bed. Feeding the vines gently, shaping a soft shelter overhead, low leaves, not too thick, with spaces between to let in sun. Other dragons came. Watched. Didn't approach. They felt the shift. This wasn't just a nest. It was a claim. A personal one. And the orphans, those quiet, half-healed, misfit dragons I'd gathered, watched with still eyes. And I could feel something shifting between us. Not submission. Not fear. Recognition. The alpha wasn't just protecting them anymore. He was raising one of them. And they would not forget that. Chapter 10, The Wings That Fold Too Tight. He watched me for 3 days. Not from the tree line, not from the shadows. Stormcutters weren't built for hiding. He perched out in the open, on the low cliff just beyond the grove, where the wind curved over the canopy and brushed the moss like breath. Wings folded tight against his body, spine stiff, eyes narrow. He didn't sleep. Didn't fly. Didn't speak. The hatchling chirped constantly. It had begun teetering around the cradle like a creature made of rubber and nerve, wobbling forward with blind confidence and collapsing into the moss with a sound that almost resembled laughter. I didn't move far from it. I didn't need to. The grove responded to its needs without command. Leaves bowed over when it cried. Warmth pooled around its den. Vines peeled open when it wandered. It didn't understand me as alpha. It understood me as presence. As safe. But the stormcutter didn't move. Didn't blink when the hatchling chirped. Didn't twitch when I coiled another vine into place to catch the hatchling from another clumsy tumble. Only watched. On the 4th day, he stepped down from the cliff. He was adolescent. No longer small, but not yet crowned with the full structure of his breed. His facial horns curved only half the length they would one day reach. The feathers on his wings hadn't yet grown long enough to trail behind him in flight. His color was rust, not bright, not dull, but layered in patches like soot-stained stone. He approached without fanfare. No rumble. No call. But every dragon in the grove shifted. Gronklets paused mid-graze. Nadders twisted in the branches to watch. Even the whispering death hatchlings lifted their heads from their burrow and grew still. I rose slowly from my coil beside the hatchling's nest and met him. He stopped just outside the root cradle. The hatchling didn't notice. It was busy biting the vine I'd grown as a playstick, gumming it uselessly with toothless chirps. The stormcutter's jaw tightened. He turned his eyes to me. And still said nothing. I reached toward him, not physically, not yet. Through the roots. The island. The awareness we all shared. It was not mind reading. It was resonance. And his resonance was loud. confused, unsteady, tight, like wings that couldn't stretch. Why not me? It wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. The emotion hit like pressure from the inside out. Not rage. Not defiance. Just a kind of aching confusion. He'd been the strongest among the orphans before the hatchling came. Old enough to patrol. Big enough to fight. Smart enough to imitate my skypath technique once and fly to the third platform on his own. He had waited to be seen. And then I'd chosen the smallest. The helpless. He didn't understand. He didn't have the words for jealousy. But he felt it. I stepped forward slowly, keeping my wings tight. I let the roots beneath him grow soft, inviting, not commanding. I didn't lower my head. He wasn't ready for that. But I didn't tower, either. He tensed. Muscles coiled. Then, for the first time, he growled. A short, broken sound. Too thin to challenge. Too sharp to ignore. The hatchling chirped and tumbled sideways into a vine. Didn't cry. The stormcutter's head twitched toward the sound. Then away again. I understood now. It wasn't just jealousy. It was grief. He had waited to be claimed. Had told himself he didn't need it. Had led younger dragons. Had played protector. Had watched me make glades and dens and sky paths. And when a single creature newborn, helpless, became more than all his waiting, he broke. I could end it. A show of force. A roar. One step forward and a snap of wings would send him reeling. But it would cut something that wouldn't heal. So I didn't move. Instead, I lay back down. Not beside the hatchling. Beside him. He flinched. Didn't retreat. I reached down again, this time through the soil beneath us both. Let the roots bloom gently. A second cradle. Not as small. Firmer. Wider branches. Stronger moss. It grew behind him slowly. He stared at it. Then turned away. Not because he didn't want it. Because he couldn't admit that he did. But he didn't leave. He sat. Closer than before. Didn't look at me. Didn't look at the hatchling. But when night fell, he didn't fly back to the cliff. He curled beside the new root cradle and let his wings open just once, then close again. And I let the moss curl higher over him. Not a den. Not a cage. A gesture. A truth. I had not chosen one. I was choosing all of them. Some needed playvines. Some needed space. Some needed to be seen before they could admit they'd ever been invisible. I would be father to this island. Even the pieces that no longer knew how to ask for it. Chapter 11, The Sky That Bends to Me. They came at dawn. Not in silence, no dragon that large flies silently, but with purpose. With discipline. The kind of approach that belonged to flight formations, not wild swarms. I sensed them before I saw them, a weight in the air like the low tremor of distant thunder. Not heavy. Not threatening. Just present. I rose from my coil beside the grove before the sun touched the cliffs. The hatchling was already awake, teetering on two legs and flapping damp wings toward a curled vine I had shaped into a toy. It chirped as I stepped away, but didn't follow. The stormcutter, still half curled in his moss bed, watched without a sound. When I broke the tree line, the sky was already shifting. 12 dragons. Not young. Not aged. In their prime. They came in a slow arc from the east, wings flared, tail steady. A formation. Not military. But not a flock. They flew in layers 3 deep, 4 wide, none jostling for space. Their species varied. 3 monstrous nightmares, 2 scaldrons, a lean storm cutter at the tip, No natter. No gronkle. No younglings. I knew what they were before they landed. A leaderless flight. Alphaless dragons. Not feral. Not rogue. Unclaimed. I had read about them. Watched their fragments in show canon. Flights formed when dragons lost their alpha through war, or death, or betrayal. They didn't scatter. They looked for the next signal. And now they were here. I landed before they did. On the southern ridge, wings folded, head high. They spiraled down in silence, slow, deliberate, never touching until all 12 had landed in a wide arc before me. The lead storm cutter stepped forward first, his eyes scanning, not bowing. He didn't roar. He didn't speak. But his posture asked the question. Are you it? I didn't respond with force. I didn't need to. I stepped forward once, slowly, and exhaled into the roots beneath me. The vines in the ridge's stone crumbled, then grew curling outward in a spiral that moved behind me and around the circle. Moss flowed in its wake. The forest bloomed behind my breath. The dragons all watched. None moved. But they felt it. The ground changed because I willed it. Not with magic. With presence. I stepped forward again. The leader flared his wings once. Then bowed. Not low. Not groveling. Just enough. Enough to say, yes. One by one, the others lowered their heads. 12 dragons. No need for words. They had been searching for order. And they had found it. It wasn't pride that moved through me then. It wasn't victory. It was something cleaner. Satisfaction. Not in ruling. In building. This island, this territory, I had shaped with caution at first. Slow growth. Root by root. But now I saw the shape it could take. Not just one island. Not just a cradle for misfits and orphans. An empire. Not in war. Not in flame. In growth. I lifted my head, and the vines beneath me thickened. The moss pulsed out across the flat ridge like water poured across canvas. Then I turned to the east. Toward open sea. And I called. Not with a roar. With will. The roots inside me pulsed downward. Across the soil. Toward the coast. The vine path I'd already grown trembled. Felt the signal. Then moved. Faster this time. My reach was stronger now. More dragons meant more presence. More presence meant more life. The floating platforms began to extend eastward, half-formed buds of moss and bark rising from the sea like islands being born. 1. 2. 3. More to come. I would not stop here. There were other islands. Other strays. Flights with no alpha. Younglings born on shattered cliffs. Elders too old to fight for dominance but too proud to bend to the wrong rule. I would make room for all of them. My territory would be more than safe. It would be invitational. Living. Not ruled. Led. I turned back to the 12 dragons before me. They had not moved. I stepped down from the ridge and walked between them. One by one, I met their eyes. Didn't demand submission. Didn't command loyalty. Just let them see. The island grew where I walked. New vines curled around stone. Trees shifted to make way. When I reached the last of them, the youngest Scaldron, I curled a vine beneath her feet and lifted it just enough to shift her forward. She flinched. Looked up. I lowered my head, not in bow but in invitation. She stepped closer. The others followed. And I knew then, I was no longer just alpha of an island. I was alpha of a movement. Chapter 12, The Shape of My Dominion. I expanded the island because I could. Not for glory. Not because anyone told me to. Because it was mine. And I wanted it bigger. The new dragons had settled quickly. That was the first sign. No territory disputes. No skirmishes. They folded into the island's rhythm like leaves folding toward sun. Each one found their place, the cauldrons near the freshwater basin I'd coaxed into shape at the base of the western cliffs, the monstrous nightmares taking to the sun-heated ledges I'd deliberately cleared of trees. But obedience wasn't enough. I didn't want dragons that just followed. I wanted dragons that grew. So I began to train them. Not in the way men trained dragons. Not with rope, nor punishment. With space. With design. The first step was simple. I expanded the ridge paths. Cut new channels through the forest using root control and soil movement. Not to clear the forest but to shape it. Narrow tunnels formed, twisted, sloped. Some ended in drop-offs. Others curved upward into open-air chambers made entirely from overlapping canopy. They weren't just paths. They were courses. For flying. For dodging. For learning speed and memory. I walked them myself, slowly, dragging my presence through the soil so the plants knew these routes were to stay open. Then I brought the young dragons there. The stormcutter came first. Not the adolescent one who'd watched the hatchling. He still sulked, still hovered close to the grove, watching more than flying. This one was a larger female, one of the Eastern 12. She flew with surgical precision, and when she ducked under the first tree arch without brushing the vine, I shaped the next path tighter. Made it a test. She passed. Others followed. Soon, the monstrous nightmares tried more reckless, more flame than finesse. I adjusted the lower route for them, growing moss wall ledges to catch them when they slipped. Let them burn what they needed. Fire didn't scare this island. The roots could take it. For the grand CKLs and smaller flyers, I shaped the high walk. Flat vine bridges twisted through the treetops, narrow enough to force balance, wide enough for 2 legs at a time. I made them flex slightly enough that dragons had to adjust as they walked. No laziness. No waiting for instincts to save them. They had to think. I didn't teach them how to move. I gave them a place that made them move better. The island became their teacher. They didn't know it, but they learned from the way I shaped it. They adapted. Grew sharper. Quicker. The whispering deaths started coiling tighter in their burrows, anticipating patterns. The natters started flying in tighter formations. They trained each other by reacting to the space I built. And all the while, I expanded the island further. South, where the stone was brittle, I laid root over rock and extended the coastline 20 meters, then 30. Slow. Purposeful. I didn't want cliffs that crumbled. I wanted platforms. Landing zones. I planted heavy trees at the edges to anchor the growth. Formed half-caves beneath them for larger dragons to rest in. One of the cauldrons claimed the lowest one and turned it into a den within a day. The island shaped itself around her sleep. To the north, I pulled the tree line back by force. Not destruction. Redirection. I grew fire-resistant plants where the sun hit hardest. Monstrous nightmares gathered there by instinct, happy to feel the warmth and have space to stretch their wings. The orphans, too, began to grow into the space. They didn't look like orphans anymore. The adolescent stormcutter who had once watched in silence now flew the high-wind courses I made, folding and spinning in sharp arcs that left the others breathless. He didn't look at me when he landed near the hatchling's grove, but he stayed nearby. Often. The hatchling, meanwhile, had begun exploring. It didn't fly yet. But it climbed. I found it once on a platform 4 meters above the grove, blinking at me from a vine bough I'd forgotten to curl. It chirped when it saw me and fell sideways. I caught it with the root before it touched the ground. It didn't fear falling. Because I never let it fall. And that mattered. Even the elders began to shift. Some of the oldest dragons, those with scars instead of wings, who had long since stopped challenging anything, started to linger near the training routes. Watching. Breathing slower. Thinking. I didn't rush them. They'd join when they were ready. Because here, growth wasn't forced. It was fed. By me. By the island. By every breath the forest took. No one else in this world remembered what I did. No one knew why I shaped the island this way. Why I trained dragons to rely on each other, to move with the land, not against it. But I did. Because I remembered the chaos of Canaan. The burning. The betrayal. The broken dragons who followed war because no one taught them another way. I wasn't changing the past. I was rewriting the future. And it was working. By the end of the month, the island had doubled in shape. I felt its pulse beneath me, stronger now. Wider. The roots hummed at the edge of my senses like new breath entering old lungs. And I knew. This was only the beginning. Chapter 13, The Wing That Seeks. He didn't bow when he approached. Not because of pride, but because he knew he didn't have to. I'd seen it coming for weeks. The way he moved differently through the high wind courses, gliding not just with precision, but with control. The way the others, young and old alike, watched him more than me when he flew. Not because he was stronger. Because he was becoming something. I stood at the eastern ledge when he landed beside me, talons clicking against the carved stone. Morning mist still clung to the tops of the trees. Beneath us, the sea paths stretched outward like veins, disappearing into pale grey distance. He didn't speak. But his posture asked the question. I turned to face him fully. He stepped closer, wings tucked, spine straight. He'd grown taller. His secondary wings had begun to feather fully, their edges no longer jagged with youth. The soot rust of his scales had deepened, now edged with silver along the tips of his horns. A veteran's coloring, even if his years didn't match. He stood on the edge of adulthood now. Not just a dragon. A leader. I watched his chest rise and fall once. Then I felt it just behind his eyes, in that silent resonance we all shared through the roots. Not emotion. Intent. He wanted to go. Not away. Outward. He had heard my roots stretching beneath the ocean floor. Had flown the paths I'd grown with care and deliberate placement. He had followed the logic of the courses I carved into the forest. And now, he wanted to carve something of his own. A patrol. A flight. Not a rogue band. An extension of me. He wanted to recruit dragons from beyond the reach of my presence, dragons who'd never seen moss move, never felt warmth breathe up from the ground. He wanted to show them what we had built here. I did not answer right away. We stood at the cliff's edge for a long time, both of us still. Below, on one of the vine plates drifting near the southern coast, the hatchling practiced flapping its wings, jumping from root to root and skidding into a coil of leaf I'd shaped into a cushion. It chirped once, then chirped again louder when no one answered. The adolescent stormcutter turned his head. Watched the hatchling. Didn't smile. Didn't blink. But something in his wings softened. He understood what we were raising here. And he wanted to carry it forward. I stepped aside. Just once. A movement so slight the cliff barely registered the shift in weight. He stepped into the space I left behind. Didn't speak. Didn't roar. But he knew. I was saying yes. He would lead the patrol. No fanfare. No ritual. Only purpose. Within an hour, he had gathered 6 others. No commands had been given, but they came. A broad-winged nightmare. 2 agile natters. A smaller storm cutter, likely his chosen second. A silent, steady-eyed Skaldron. And one whispering death who never stopped watching the edges of the sky. They stood in a line beneath the arching bow I'd shaped above the mid-island rise. I approached them once, slowly, vines curling beneath my feet with each step. I touched the soil lightly, let the moss part and form a simple circle beneath them. A mark. Not of rule. Of recognition. You are mine. And now you go. I met the adolescent's eyes one last time. Still no bow. Still no words. But he nodded. A warrior's nod. A builder's nod. Then he turned. Opened his wings. And flew. The others followed without hesitation, not in formation, in trust. They climbed into the sky path, circling higher than I'd built the current route. The wind caught them clean, and for the first time since I had begun shaping this place, I saw dragons leave not in fear or exile but with my will behind them. A piece of me flying into the world. Expanding. Not empire. Legacy. For the first time, I watched another dragon carry my vision further than my roots could reach. And I felt no fear. Only growth. Chapter 14, Return with Ash on Wings. They came back at dusk. Not from the east. From above. The sky turned gold long before the sun dipped below the sea, and with it came a pressure, not fear, not danger, but the tight kind of stillness that fell across the island when something new was approaching. The dragons paused in midair. Naders mid-sprint turned their heads. Even the hatchling, tangled in the half-vine it had been chewing, looked upward and chirped once, sharp, confused. I was already on the southern cliff. Not waiting. Listening. The wind changed. I felt it before I saw them. The pull of root lines stretched like nerves across the sea paths. They had not touched the forest, but they were close enough now that I could feel their shapes. Not presence. Not allegiance. Difference. And then the first silhouette broke through the sun. The storm cutter. The adolescent no longer moved like a student. He moved like a leader. His wings were scorched along the right edge, blackened not by natural fire, but something unnatural. Slick, almost oily, a shimmer like pitch that didn't belong to any dragon I knew. But he flew without hesitation. Without limp. He was intact. He had returned. And he was not alone. 3 others followed in a staggered V formation. Not in military order, but with discipline. Space between them. Caution. I watched them land. The forest went silent. The patrol touched down one by one on the wide route clearing I had shaped days ago for gathering. Not for battle. For moments like this. The storm cutter landed last. Folded his wings. Looked at me. I stepped forward. Did not ask. He nodded once, then turned to the 3 behind him. The first was a pale-scaled dragon, smaller than any of his patrol team. Not a breed I recognized. Its wings were thin, almost translucent in places, and its chest rose and fell too fast. But its posture was steady. Alert. It watched me with slitted eyes that never blinked, black irises with white centers. It never bowed. Never shifted. It didn't speak. But it listened. The second larger had no wings. Not torn. Absent. Grown without. A ground dragon. Its skin was deep green, with layered black ridges across its shoulders like armored bark. Its eyes were dull but aware. Its body moved in low, heavy arcs, and its claws dragged deep into the moss with every step. It had the scent of the wild. Not of feral rage. Of resilience. It had walked here. Across islands. The storm cutter said nothing, but I understood. This one had never flown. But it had followed anyway. Not because it believed. Because it had nowhere else to go. The third was the smallest. It did not stand tall. It crouched low to the ground, spine curved like it had never stood fully upright in its life. But its eyes, sunken and wide, stared into the forest like it could see through it. Its tail twitched every few seconds. It was wrong. Not corrupted, but unsettled. The others didn't crowd it. Didn't ignore it either. They let it stand between them like a fragile link. And it did not sleep. Even when it blinked, it stayed awake. My roots extended beneath them as they settled. Slowly. Testing. The pale-winged one did not react. The ground dragon shifted once and pulled back. The crouched one looked through the ground. Then faintly I felt it. Something flickered. Like the tip of a spark deep in the soil. Not from me. From it. I didn't pull back. Not yet. The stormcutter stepped forward again, and this time, he finally spoke, not aloud, not with voice. With presence. They are not broken. He projected it through the roots. The idea, the truth of it. They are not clean. They are not ready. But they are ours. He had chosen them. Not because they were powerful. Because they were needed. The others came closer than my dragons. Nadders. Grand CKLs. Nightmares. The orphans. The elders. No one rushed. But no one turned away. The pale one stepped forward first and curled against the edge of the moss circle, watching the tree lean. The ground dragon followed, resting with one leg coiled under its chest, like it wasn't sure whether to stay. The small one didn't move at all. But its tail slowed. And that, from it, was permission. I stepped forward and exhaled once. The moss beneath them warmed. The vines did not reach up. The trees did not move. But the island understood. These were new roots. Not clean. But real. And I would shape them, too. Not because they were useful. Because they had answered the call. I turned to the stormcutter, then. And for the first time, I lowered my head, not in command. But in respect. He had gone out with my will. And brought back dragons who would never have made it alone. He had not built a flock. He had grown a future. Chapter 15, The Roots That Gather. The forest whispered of movement. Not in words. Not in sounds. In pressure. Like bark curling tighter to the trunk, like moss thickening before rain. The roots beneath my feet had begun to twitch in slow, deliberate rhythms. The trees no longer swayed to wind alone. They shifted to the breath of dragons. The island was full. Not overrun. Not strained. But full. Every den I had grown now pulsed with the scent of claim. Every glade had become a resting hollow. The younger dragons circled in the sky paths without colliding. The nadders had begun to pair off and test call across the canopies. A scaldron had begun nesting in the shallow pool near the eastern ledge and refused to leave, even when the tide receded. And when I stood still long enough, I felt it. Too many dragons moving without structure. That would break us. Not now. But soon. There were rules to building a territory. Even I, in this vast body shaped from vine and earth, knew what unspoken law dictated among flight-bound creatures. It wasn't hierarchy. It was order. And if I didn't give it to them, they would build their own. So I gave them something better. A place to gather. The decision came at dawn. I flew low over the ridge and dropped into the valley that had once been too dense to shape. The basin had always been fertile, too fertile. Every time I passed over it, the roots pulsed too fast, too deep. The forest was too loud here, as if it had been waiting. I landed in the heart of it and opened my chest to the root web. Grow. Clear. Bind. The forest did not resist. It bent. Roots parted beneath me, not breaking, but folding outward. I reached into the soil and told the moss to stretch flat, not thick. I commanded the bark to grow tall but hollow, creating natural pillars around the edge of the basin shade walls. The trees bowed together, forming a loose ring. A circle. The ground at the center I left untouched. I pressed my claws into the dirt and warmed it with breath. The soil flattened. Hardened. An amphitheater. Alive. Not a throne. A center. It took 3 days. I shaped every inch myself. When it was done, I called them. Not with roar. With presence. I opened my reach across every vine path, across every den and sky course and glade. My breath passed through the roots like a drumbeat through hollow bone. Come. Now. All. They came. In waves. Not a stampede. Not an army. But a tide. The orphans arrived first, silent, alert, led by the adolescent storm cutter. His wings were no longer soot-colored. He had cleaned them. Chosen that, I knew, for this day. The patrols came next. Natters gliding in loose formation. A pair of monstrous nightmares dragging low flame across the sky as they descended. A whispering death coiling from the burrow holes in the eastern cliff like smoke-given body. Even the new ones came. The pale dragon who never spoke. The ground dragon, moving slow, but with certainty. And the crouched one, unnamed, unreadable, its tail twitching in time with the root beat beneath the moss. They did not know what I would say. They did not know what this meant. But they came. Because they felt it. I waited until the sun hung above the trees. Then I stepped into the center of the gathering ring. They didn't bow. I didn't need them to. Their stillness was louder than submission. I opened my wings. Let my breath warm the stone underfoot. Let my presence pulse up through the roots. Then I walked a slow circle. Each dragon watched. I did not speak. I showed. Roots curled upward from the earth, slowly forming tendrils of thick bark and vine that rose like carved columns. 4 of them. Equal distance apart. 1 for each patrol. Not titles. Roles. The first column, shaped with wide rings, solid, layered in marks that pulsed gently with heat. For the fire bearers. The fighters. The second, thinner, taller, layered in alternating root. For the swift. The scouts. The third, heavy. Set deep into the stone. Covered in moss, its rings still moving even as I shaped it. For the steady. The elders. The wise. And the last, curled like a sleeping tail. Subtle. Quiet. But dense. For the young. I let the dragons move on their own. They approached, one by one. Some uncertain. Some bold. But they found their place. By dusk, the columns were surrounded. Not assigned. Chosen. The adolescent storm cutter approached last. He walked not to a column. But to me. And stood at my side. I said nothing. Just stepped forward again, to the base of the central circle, and exhaled one last time. The roots pulsed outward in all directions. A final shape rose, a spiral, curled outward from the center of the stone. A memory of my breath. A symbol. Not of rule. Of origin. And then I stepped back. The dragons let out no roar. No chant. Just one sound. A low rumble, shared in the chest of every beast. From the largest nightmare to the crouched dragon who never blinked. It echoed through the trees. The forest heard it. And it answered. Leaves shifted. Roots pulsed. The moss thickened. The air warmed. They were not waiting for a king. They had chosen a center. a root. And I was it. Not alone. Not above. But beneath all of them. Chapter 16, Another Root Awakens. The cradle pulsed again. It had been quiet for weeks, just the soft chirps of the first hatchling, now nimble and brash, clambering over the moss walls I had built and crashing into vine piles like a boulder without brakes. It had begun to develop teeth. Its wings, still small, were hardening. And it knew its name, not a word, not a title, but the pattern of sound I gave it in breath and presence. It knew me. It loved me. And it never stopped chewing everything I grew. But today, the cradle was not filled with chewing or chirping. It throbbed. Alive. And this time, not with movement from the hatchling. The second egg had not been laid. It had appeared. I found it at dawn. The moss around the cradle had curved away from the center, the roots folding into a half spiral that had not been there the night before. No dragon had been near. None of the younger natters or flight mares had access to this space. I would have sensed them. I would have felt the root web shift. But there it was. Heavy. Thick-veined. And already warm. Wrapped in vine. Not as a nest. As if the island itself had grown the egg. I approached slowly. It wasn't the color of the first hatchling. This shell was stone dark. Not black. Just layered. Striated like bark under pressure. And massive. 3 times the size. I lowered my head and breathed across its surface. The heat came back stronger. Steady. Patient. Old. I felt it before it hatched. The pulse. The rhythm. The shape of the life curled inside. I knew it before it broke. This was no natter. No nightmare. No pale-winged, unspoken breed. This was a Foreverwing. One of my kind. I didn't speak. I didn't roar. I just stepped back and waited. It hatched at midday. The shell did not split so much as peel, curling back in thick layers of softened bark. Steam poured out. The moss pulled back as if it, too, recognized what was inside. It crawled out slowly. Not with weakness, with weight. Even young, its steps pushed the soil into shallow impressions. It had no teeth yet. No horns. Just the slow, heavy presence of something born to be still and vast and rooted. It blinked once. Then twice. And looked at me. There was no fear. It didn't chirp. Didn't coo. It stood. Steady. Silent. And took its first step. The ground responded. Not to command. To kin. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since my first flight here. I stepped closer. Not low, not cautious. Proud. I curled a vine beneath the hatchling's body and lifted it gently onto a shelf of soft-packed moss near the cradle's edge. It didn't resist. It didn't react. It simply accepted. Because it understood. Its roots ran deeper than instinct. It belonged. The other hatchling came bounding in not long after, dragging a dead vine in its mouth and chirping like it had discovered a new species. It skidded to a stop when it saw the newcomer. They stared at each other for a long time. Then the Foreverwing hatchling tilted its head, slow. The smaller dragon tossed the vine at it and flopped beside it like this was normal. 2 hatchlings. Side by side. Different. But ours. I looked at the new Foreverwing again. Even this small, I could feel it. It was growing faster than the first hatchling had. It pulsed with potential. And not just power. Reach. It could extend the territory. Not tomorrow. Not next week. But soon. I wasn't alone anymore. When it grew, its root web would stretch beneath the moss, slow and wide. It would speak to the vines, shape the forest, forge platforms across the sea the way I had done. It would take time. Years. But the truth was already real. The future would not die with me. There would be another alpha. One born not to fight for dominance. One born into belonging. The dragons nearby began to shift when they felt the change. Some came closer. Others stayed at the edge. They did not crowd. They knew. This hatchling was not theirs. It was mine. The adolescent stormcutter came last. He watched the young Foreverwing, expression unreadable. He approached slowly, wings half flared, and dipped his head not to me but to the newborn. Then he looked at me. And nodded. Not for permission. For recognition. He understood what this meant. One day, I would not have to stretch every vine myself. I would not have to be the island alone. There would be two of us. And eventually, more. Chapter 17, Lessons Beneath the Canopy. It was not born to move fast. That much was clear from the first hour. The second Foreverwing hatchling emerged with weight behind its breath. Its lungs moved slow, and when it blinked, it did so as if sight itself required deliberation. The smaller dragons bounced around it like insects flicking across stone. It did not react. Not because it lacked the mind to understand. Because it already knew it did not need to. It was born with patience in its chest. And something more than instinct. It was born to grow. I didn't name it. Not aloud. Not yet. Naming was not for something that would outlive sound. This one, like me, would shape the land, not move through it. It would make roads in moss, not in sky. It would rule from stillness, not flight. But that day, I gave it its first task. We began far from the cradle southwest, beneath the slope where the sea met the cliffs. I had cleared this land days earlier, knowing it would be needed. The soil here was loamy, rich with runoff. A place where growth came easy but not strong. Left on its own, the forest here grew soft. Entangled. Weak. Perfect for training. I led it there at dawn. It followed behind me not quickly, but consistently, each footstep slow, deliberate. Its tail dragged. Its eyes never blinked. When we arrived, I turned and let my presence sink into the soil. The moss parted. Roots shifted. I curled a small section of vine upward and breathed life into it. It grew 2 meters in under 10 seconds. Then I let it go. The vine slackened, lost form, collapsed. I stepped back and looked at the hatchling. Then I said nothing. I just stood there. Waiting. It stared at the space I'd cleared. Not at me. Then stepped forward, stopped, and dug its claws into the soil. The ground responded not because it had power yet, but because it was connected. The roots beneath it were already curling toward the warmth in its chest. Toward the potential. The vine twitched. But didn't grow. The hatchling's breath caught. I saw its chest flutter. It blinked. Looked back at me once, unsure. I didn't move. Just let my presence fall into the soil again, this time not to shape. To amplify. It felt that. It turned back. Dug its claws deeper. And growled. The sound was low. Wet. Not threatening. Not even vocalized with intent. Just pressure. The vine shivered. Curled. Then broke upward. It grew 20 centimeters. No more. Then it fell still. But the hatchling felt it. I watched it breathe out, shoulders slackening, tail twitching just once. The effort had been real. Even that tiny growth had drained it. But it hadn't failed. It had learned. It stepped back and sat down. Not collapsed. Saturday. Its eyes drifted across the soil. Its head tilted. And it reached forward, one claw pressing into a stone nearby. The moss under the stone pulsed once. Then turned green. It wouldn't have been visible to most. But I saw it. A root had reached up. Without being called. It wasn't shaping growth yet. But the land was beginning to respond. Already. It looked up at me again. No chirping. No sound. But its breath matched mine now. I stepped forward, lowered my head, and exhaled into the soil beside it. Together, we watched the vines grow. Not fast. Not large. Just steady. Two forever wings. Shaping land side by side. This was how it would begin. And how it would continue, long after I stopped breathing. Over the next week, I shaped the grove into its first learning ground. Not a den. Not a nursery. A living field. The trees were planted far apart, not for shade, but for reach, so the hatchling's roots could move without entangling too quickly. I grew ridges of shallow-rooted moss along the ground to give it easy material to shape. Each day, I led it to a different part of the grove and watched. It never rushed. Sometimes it only grew one tendril. Sometimes it only listened. But by the end of the 5th day, it had shaped a ring of moss that remained even after it left. And that was enough. The adolescent storm cutter came once, watched from a tree limb high above, and did not speak. The hatchling ignored him. But when the younger dragons passed the grove now, they walked around it not because they feared the hatchling. Because they respected what it was. It hadn't spoken. Hadn't flown. Hadn't fought. But the land remembered it already. And I did too. I wasn't raising a dragon. I was shaping a successor. Chapter 18, Fire Without Flame. It found me before I could look for it. The ground dragon returned at dusk. Not dragging its claws through moss like usual, not slinking through the shadows like an uncertain guest. It walked upright. Steady. With purpose. The adolescent storm cutter had been the first to see it. He dropped low from one of the tree arches near the basin and followed it in silence. No warning. No alarm. Just a nod of presence as the creature moved through the inner valley, toward where I had shaped the rich root chamber days earlier. I waited there. Not because I sensed danger. Because I felt something had changed. It stepped into the clearing, its broad chest rising and falling not with exhaustion, but with heat. Its scales no longer dulled in the sun. They shimmered faintly. Not with gloss. With glow. A warmth that did not come from within, but clung to its body like static air. It bowed. That was new. Then it stepped closer and exhaled. Not fire. Not smoke. A pulse. The air rippled. Grass died. The moss blackened around its feet instantly withered, not burned. But the death was not complete. I pressed my presence into the roots beneath us. They weren't gone. They were, mutated. Twisted. Stronger. Slower. Not rotting. Not thriving. Just changing. I stepped forward. And breathed once across the blackened earth. The moss flared back to life, not the same green. A darker color. Thick. Heavy. I blinked once. Then felt the truth. It had changed the soil. I looked again at the dragon. Its breathing was shallow now. Not strained. Contained. It hadn't just stumbled into power. It had absorbed something. I pressed into the ground behind it. Deep. Beyond my usual reach. Past the roots I had planted, past the layers of soil I had shaped. Until I hit something hard. A chamber. Not natural. Stone reinforced with iron. Sealed. buried, cracked open, and hot. The pulse of energy that had leaked from it wasn't fire. It wasn't anything the dragons of this world were meant to wield. It was the echo of long-dead technology human-made, hidden long before any of them could have known to look. It had been radiation. And it had found a body to cling to. The ground dragon looked at me. Still silent. But in its breath, I heard the question. Am I a danger? I stepped closer, pressed my claw into the moss it had scorched. Then deeper. The roots here had not died. They had become more. Stronger. Tougher. Still mine. But different. I didn't recoil. I exhaled. Not to heal. To accept. The moss around us shifted again, this time curling upward thick, broader leafed, darker green. Leaves large enough to shield a full-grown gronkel. I realized then. The soil touched by the dragon's breath was not ruined. It was fertile. More than fertile. It amplified my shaping. I pressed my presence further, testing. Shaped a small tree. Expected 10 seconds of slow growth. It rose in 2. Stronger. Not brittle. Still alive. And it bent toward the dragon when it passed. It was reacting to him. My chest curled with quiet pressure. Not shock. Not fear. Satisfaction. We had a new element. Not fire. Not acid. Not storm. Radiant heat. Silent. Slow. Changing. Not a weapon. A force. He looked at me again. I did not command him. I gave him a section of forest near the far eastern rise, where the soil was less stable and the roots shallow. He walked there alone. And the land followed him. By nightfall, 3 new trees had grown. All thick. All dark. Not green. But alive. Chapter 19, The Glowing Garden. He didn't ask for territory. He simply walked. The ground dragon low-bodied, thick-shouldered, radiant not in flame but in something quieter never raised his voice. Never claimed a space with roar or claw. He only breathed. And the island changed around him. The first moss he blackened had grown back stronger. The trees that sprouted in his wake bent toward him not out of reverence, but out of response. Their leaves grew larger, their trunks thicker, their bark smoother. Even their scent changed, less wet, more mineral-rich, more alive. He had touched something beneath the forest that I had not created. But now it answered me. And so I gave him space. Not a den. Not a nest. A garden. At the far eastern edge of the island, past the ridges and canopy, there had once been a dead field, a stretch of stone where no roots took, where the soil was too shallow and the wind too sharp for anything but lichen. I had shaped around it. Avoided it. Until now. I landed in its center at dusk. The stars hadn't yet surfaced, but the sky had dimmed enough that the air cooled and flattened. A good temperature for shaping. A neutral sky. I pressed my claws into the stone. Felt the deadness. And then reached downward, deep, letting my breath curl into the roots that barely clung to this place. Then I called to him. Not with sound. Through the earth. He arrived in silence. No entourage. No hesitation. He stepped into the field and stood beside me. The air around him bent. Not sharply. Slowly. Like heat over stone, barely visible. I stepped aside. And waited. He pressed his massive feet into the rock. Then exhaled. The effect was immediate. The ground didn't split. It softened. Not melted. Not broken. It relaxed under him, like the stone recognized its new state. Thin veins of light shimmered outward in a web, invisible unless you knew how to see it, not light in the way dragons used it. Radiation. Heat. But slow. Controlled. I pressed into the soil behind him and followed the pulse. Then added my own. The vines responded faster than normal. Much faster. Not just speed, they grew stronger. A vine I'd intended to stretch 5 meters went 10. The leaves on its stem doubled in width, turned darker. The bark thickened so rapidly I heard it creak. The ground dragon said nothing. But he turned his head just once and nodded. And so I shaped the garden. Not alone. Together. I let him walk freely, breathing into the stone in quiet, measured exhales. Each pulse twisted the soil into a state I could bend more easily. He never overstepped. He never pressed too hard. He gave shape. I gave direction. In 2 days, we had formed something new. A living forest, unlike the rest of the island. The glowing garden. The trees here were taller, but straighter, with bark that shimmered faintly in the dark. The moss that covered the ground had a bluish tint. The leaves gave off no scent, but they were warm to the touch. Dragons came. Not immediately. They drifted in one by one, hesitant. A pair of curious grown CKLs tried first, sniffing the moss, then settling in a curl at the garden's edge. They left an hour later and didn't speak. But returned the next day. Then came a natter. Then 2 more. Then a young monstrous nightmare who refused to land, but circled above the canopy for hours. They weren't drawn by command. They were drawn by change. The forest here pulsed differently. Faster. Sharper. Alive, but not familiar. Some dragons stayed longer than they should have. The adolescent stormcutter arrived on the 3rd day. Watched in silence as one of the younger natters pressed its wing into a vine and gasped only once. The vine had left a thin pattern along the scales. Not burned. Not scarred. Changed. Strengthened, maybe. Hardened. The natter couldn't stop staring at it. The stormcutter came to me that night. Not in fear. In caution. His presence touched mine through the roots. Not a warning. A question. Should they stay? I stepped into the glowing garden before dawn. Found 6 dragons resting beneath the strange trees. One was the crouched one from the stormcutter's earlier patrol, the silent dragon who never blinked. It had not moved in hours. But the ground beneath it was shifting. Not visibly. Subtly. As if something under the moss was waking up. I turned to the ground dragon. He waited at the edge. Did not approach. Did not interfere. He had shaped the soil, not the minds of those who followed. That was my role. And I would not stop them. This was still my territory. My roots. Even if they changed beneath me. By nightfall, I had reinforced the edge of the glowing garden. I shaped thick vines to rise around it, not walls, but boundaries. Open enough for dragons to enter. Contained enough to observe what they became. Because something was growing here. Not just trees. Not just roots. Possibility. And I would not stop it. I would guide it. Chapter 20, The Root That Resisted. The hatchling slipped into the glowing garden at dawn. No warning. No invitation. I felt it only after it had already crossed the moss threshold, its slow, pulsing presence curling beneath the stone path like a familiar heartbeat, but different. Too eager. Too deep. And too fast. The garden reacted. Not with rejection. With hunger. The ground dragon didn't move. He had already sensed it. He stood to the north, half shadowed by one of the new trees, its trunk lined in faint lines of heat, pulsing every few minutes in quiet rhythm. The hatchling stepped into the clearing and breathed. The roots surged. Vines curled upward before its breath touched them, responding faster than they ever had during training. Moss unrolled in carpets. Leaves bloomed instantly. The hatchling didn't even notice at first. It simply turned in slow circles, blinking wide-eyed, excited. But I saw the truth before it did. It wasn't shaping alone. Something else was helping it. Something deep in the garden's floor. It wasn't the ground dragon. It wasn't me. It was another pulse. Slower. Heavier. Older. I moved. From the central ridge I opened my wings and dropped into the garden in silence. I passed beneath two of the radiant-barked trees. The adolescent storm cutter saw me and cleared a path. The dragons resting at the edge stood slowly, watching. None approached. They felt it. The vines around the hatchling shifted again. Not up. Away. Pulled back from the stone. A moment later, the ground beneath them split. Not violently. Like breath drawn from beneath earth. And something rose. Massive. Coated in vines. A second Foreverwing. But not newborn. Not young. Grown. Its scales were moss-stained, bark-thick. Its wings were slow to unfold, but not weak. Its eyes opened with effort as if the lids had not parted in years. It had been beneath the glowing garden this entire time. Dormant. Buried. Waiting for signal. The hatchling stood frozen. Its vines twitched, then went still. It turned and looked at me. Then at it. Then back to me. It did not understand. But I did. The older Foreverwing looked at me with eyes that did not blink. And breathed once. The garden answered it. Trees bent. Moss curled. My roots recoiled. Challenge. Not spoken. Not ritual. Instinct. It had waited for my presence to grow. And now it wanted to know. Who ruled the soil? I stepped forward. Did not flare wings. Did not roar. Just breathed into the stone. And the garden twisted behind me. Not against me. With me. The fight began without motion. Two titans rooted to the ground, sending commands through the roots. My vines surged first. Broad. Fast. Focused. I coiled them upward, shaping 4 lashes of mossed bark to strike its legs. It ignored them. Didn't resist. Didn't dodge. It grew around them, forming a wall of thorns from the very moss I had just summoned. The vines twisted back toward me. I inhaled and dropped my weight into the soil. The ground shook. Roots surged upward in a wide ring around me, my oldest breath line, shaped during the first day of the garden. They moved fast. Trained. Familiar. They slammed into its flanks. The dragon shifted. Wings spread. Not to fly. To root. It pressed its claws deeper into the soil and sent a pulse I felt in my ribs. The vines closest to me withered. They didn't die. They broke allegiance. Switched to its call. I responded immediately. I drew the fight away from the hatchling. I charged. Not like a beast. Like a mountain. Our bodies collided in the heart of the garden, stone cracking under the weight of both of us. My claws dug deep into its shoulder. Its tail whipped into my flank, bark sharp and heavy with vines that tangled and twisted with every movement. We weren't biting. We were shaping the world beneath us with every step. Roots collided like tectonic plates. Vines fought in silence. The trees around us shook but did not fall. This was not dominance through blood. This was will against will. And mine would not break. I pressed my breath into the garden again, this time deeper. Down to the first foundation. The oldest root. The one I had planted the day the ground dragon had breathed the first radiation into the moss. The island answered. Loyal. Mine. The second Foreverwing stumbled. Not physically. Inward. Its vines twitched. Its roots hesitated. It had felt the truth. I had shaped this land. Not by instinct. Not by hunger. By choice. And it paused. I didn't wait. I surged upward, curled my body over its shoulder, and slammed it into the stone. Not breaking bone. Breaking resistance. It shuddered. And went still. For a long time, we stood like that. Locked. Breathing. Roots tangled. Then I stepped back. It didn't rise. But it breathed once more. And sent its will into the soil. Not in opposition. In support. I felt it instantly. The vines closest to us strengthened. New bridges of moss formed between sections of the garden I had left unshaped. My territory expanded. Not outward. Downward. It was linking to another island. Slowly. Carefully. I turned to it. Lowered my head. Not to submit. To accept. It raised its head and echoed the motion. Submission. Not as servant. As ally. The hatchling chirped once from behind me. It stepped forward and touched the older Foreverwing's claw. The roots beneath them both pulsed in unison. The dragons watching from the edges shifted closer. Not afraid. Now they understood. There was more than one Foreverwing. But only one Alpha. Chapter 21, The First Mistake. The hatchling began shaping territory. Not from pride. Not to impress. It did it because it could. That morning, I felt its presence stretch into the lower glade beside the eastern ridge, the section I had long left untouched, not because it was unsafe, but because it was claimed. A wide basin of mineral-rich soil, fed by runoff from the cliffs, home to thick grasses and tall, narrow trees. I had grown none of them. They had shaped themselves, adapted to the dragons who hunted there. One, in particular. The Screaming Death. It had not submitted to me. Not yet. It hadn't challenged me either. It came and went. Burrowed deep beneath the stone. Curled along the cavernous paths carved through the ridge's underlayer. A dragon that lived in spiral tunnels and turned air into vibration. Its breath wasn't fire, it was sound. And not melody. Not warning. Fury. It had never caused problems because it had never been disturbed. Until now. The hatchling did not know. It wandered into the lower glade at mid-morning. I felt its breath stretch downward, not far. Just far enough. It pressed its claws into the soil and curled a vine upward. Small. Incomplete. Still learning. The vine grew faster than it should have. The hatchling had shaped it from the outer ring of the glowing garden soil, still tinged with the radiant touch of the ground dragon. The root pulsed once as it grew. And touched something it shouldn't have. A tunnel. Old. Deep. Spiral cut through ancient basalt. The Screaming Death felt it instantly. It woke. And the ground answered with rage. The pulse hit me like an echo in the ribs. I froze mid-step on the ridge, my roots already reaching for the hatchling's signal. I felt it chirp once. Then scream. The kind of cry that wasn't fear. Confusion. The kind that only young creatures give when they do not understand what anger feels like. I dropped from the cliff and landed near the glade in seconds. The soil had already begun to split. Circular tremors pushed upward through the moss in spiraling patterns, no fire, no claw, just pressure. The hatchling crouched low, wings half spread, tail coiled, vines snapping back as if rejected by the earth. Then the tunnel cracked open. The screaming death rose. It was massive. Not in height. In length. Body built like a serpent. Wings jagged and heavy, not made for air but for raw power in tight spaces. Its mouth opened once, wide enough to snap the hatchling in half. But it didn't. It just screamed. The sound hit like a shockwave. The trees bowed. The moss blackened. The hatchling slammed backward into the ridge wall, breath knocked out of its lungs. It didn't cry again. It just shook. I stepped between them. Not with roar. With presence. I exhaled into the soil. The trees behind me straightened. The vines surged. The earth coiled. The screaming death didn't retreat. It twisted in place, drilling its lower body into the soil as its scream thickened. The sound became low now, not attack. Claim. It was defending its space. I didn't roar. I pressed deeper. Let the roots beneath me push into the hollow it had carved, into the layers of spiral stone it had called home for years. I touched them. And I understood. It hadn't built that tunnel. It had been born in it. This place was not just territory. It was nest. The hatchling had violated it without meaning to. But dragons don't care for intent. Only order. I moved forward slowly. Let the soil harden beneath the screaming death. Let the moss retreat. Let the roots bow. Not in fear. In acknowledgement. This was not a battle. This was a correction. The screaming death narrowed its eyes. Snapped its jaws once, not in rage. Warning. Then turned to the hatchling. Still breathing. Still alive. But coiled in confusion. I lowered my head between them. Blocked the line of sight. The scream faded. Not into silence. Into acceptance. The screaming death coiled downward again, body spinning slowly back into its spiral tunnel. But as it vanished, it sent a pulse back through the earth. A warning. Do not shape here again. I did not reply. Not with thought. But with action. I turned to the hatchling. It looked up at me. Dazed. Shamed. Not injured but shaken in a way it had never felt before. I pressed my claw into the ground beside it. Grew a vine from the stone, thin, weak. A lesson. Then I curled it backward. And cut it off. The hatchling watched. Then nodded. No chirp. No noise. It understood. This world had limits. Even to us. Even to Foreverwings. Even to alphas. We could shape soil and vine. But some roots were not ours. That night, I shaped a border along the edge of the lower glade. Not a wall. A memory. Moss turned black along a perfect circle. No one would step beyond it. Not unless called. And the hatchling did not return to that side of the island. Not for weeks. But when it did, it waited. First. Chapter 22, The Hatchling Builds Alone. It stopped trying to impress me. That was the first sign it understood. For 3 days after its near collision with the screaming death, the hatchling stayed near the central grove, quiet, slower. It followed me at a distance but didn't seek me out. Its breath still pulsed into the soil sometimes, but shallowly, never pushing downward. It no longer asked for help. It waited. But it didn't stop growing. I watched from above as it moved one morning, not south, not back to the radiant moss of the glowing garden, but east. Into the unclaimed belt of land between the shallow water cliffs and the wind-scarred stone hills that faced the open sea. A stretch of island I had never shaped. Not dead. Not wild. Just empty. The trees there were crooked. Windswept. The roots ran shallow because the stone refused depth. Moss grew only in ridges. Even the sun took longer to warm that place. No dragons claimed it. No one wanted it. And that was where the hatchling went. It climbed a low rise of stone just before noon, stood still for nearly an hour, and then began to shape. It didn't call for me. It didn't reach for the deeper roots. It used only what was there. I felt its breath push downward not far. Just into the topsoil. It curled a single vine, wrapped it around a wind-bent sapling, and held it there. The vine didn't grow. It hardened. Twisted. Formed a spiral. Then it stopped. Waited. Another hour passed. It shaped a second. This time from moss. Slower. Flattened. The shape was wrong, more wedge than circle, but it stayed. The hatchling stepped back. Tilted its head. And tried again. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't clean. But it was deliberate. Each attempt built on the last. It didn't test the soil and abandon it. It studied it. Measured the way the wind tore across the edge. The way the stone shifted underfoot. How the roots refused to follow direction unless coaxed from above, not below. It adapted. By nightfall, I flew over in silence. The hatchling didn't look up. It was already curled near the base of the crooked sapling, now anchored in a ring of vines, short and strong, that curved like the ribs of a hollow den. No roof yet. No warmth. But shelter. Its first. Self-shaped. Nothing I had taught it directly. No breath lent. No vine corrected. This was not inheritance. This was creation. I didn't land. I watched from the shadow of the high tree, wings tucked. The adolescent storm cutter came once during the night, swept low, saw the structure, then vanished again. No words passed between us. But I felt his approval. He had learned this lesson the hard way, too. I waited until morning. Then, when the hatchling stirred, I stepped forward at last. It blinked up at me. Still no chirp. But it didn't lower its head. Didn't bow. It stepped aside, open space for me at the edge.